I know a lot of people are still wondering when this will get better or how much worse it might become. You want to see the numbers and the predictions, and we'll have more information, keeping coming to you with it soon. But the biggest variable in shaping these projections is you and your behavior.
Ottawa is facing some increased pressure to share more with Canadians about the spread and toll COVID-19 could take in this country. So what more might be coming? It's Thursday, and I'm here with At Issue. They're, of course, joining us from their home studios. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Althea Raj is here in Ottawa. Good to see you. So we know Ontario is going to present its own projections tomorrow. Premier Ford has said they are grim, that they could be a wake-up call. BC and Alberta have also shared a certain amount of information. President Trump did this week. I know the federal government is very much reliant on the provinces for the data, but they also do have something. And I'm wondering why it seems like we haven't seen anything beyond the raw data that is available out there. Chantal.
They're not, in part, reliable on the provinces for the data. They are totally reliable on the provinces for the data because it's a strength and a weakness, but we don't have one health system in this country. We have 10 or maybe 12. And every province has been gathering its own data based on how it measures it. And that is where the federal government gets the information. That is not to say that the federal government does not have models that say if it gets like this, it's going to take this, and if it gets like that, it's going to be a shorter period. But get this, once they put together all this data, and I believe they will give you projections, it's only going to be as good to project the ending of this as the least great province at getting their curve to not rise, especially if it's a larger province.
Right. So will there be a great deal of benefit to seeing it then, Andrew? Is it still important for Canadians to see?
Yes, I think first of all, as a democratic society, we should never be afraid of more information. I know people are saying, oh, people will misuse it or they'll misunderstand it, but we seem to be able to puzzle through other complicated bits of data. This one's particularly important because we're trying to motivate and mobilize people to do a very hard thing, which is basically to stay in their houses for weeks and months on end. And it is useful, I think, for people to know the dimensions and gravity of the problem. I know that the data on the raw cases isn't necessarily terribly informative because it intersects with how many tests are being performed. The more tests you are, then the more cases you might show. And it might not be that the underlying problem has gotten worse, but you've just tested more. But I think it's particularly important for people to see data on hospitalization rates, particularly intensive care usage, because that, of course, is what this whole thing is about, is trying to keep the curve below the level of the hospital capacity. And that's where that kind of number really does give you meaning, because people aren't going to be in the hospital unless they're terribly, terribly sick.
It is challenging, I guess, and maybe that's something that we should have corrected from previous pandemics. But how important do you think it is for the government to put what they have out there, Althea?
Well, I agree with Andrew. I think we are a democratic society, and therefore it's important for the government to be as transparent as it possibly can be. I think there's a hesitancy that there's a sort of fatalism that exists when the numbers come out. Oh, well, maybe tens of thousands of Canadians are projected to succumb to this virus. Does it mean that I need to stay at my house? Maybe it's harder to convince people to stay in their home if they think that the end result is already carved in stone. And I think the communication around the forecast is going to be important. The other thing to remember is that the forecast is not data. It is modeling, and therefore it's just going to give a suggestion about where they think the curve might be and what the total cases may be and what the deaths may be. And it's not going to be actually hard and fast data. And then everybody else has basically pointed out that the information varies across the country, and I think that has been the challenge for the federal government.
Yeah, and it will, of course, vary on our behavior. It is dependent on our behavior right now. I want to do one quick round, if I can, on the economic side, because the government says this is the biggest package, aid package, any government has ever presented with the wage subsidy plan, which is a lot bigger than what was initially put forward. Chantal, what do you make of this huge amount of money they are blowing out into the economy?
I don't think, again, this is not stimulus. It's a help package to get us through this. It probably comes maybe 10 days later than it could have. If the government initially had self-corrected its initial 10% version. That being said, in normal circumstances, rolling out a program like that at this level over 3 to 6 weeks would be considered a miracle. Actually, people would say this is impossible to do. So it's a huge logistical challenge, but I believe that it is important.
Andrew.
It's quite extraordinary. We're seeing tens of billions of dollars going out the door in programs that are being reinvented and redrafted 2 days after they've been released. I don't say that as criticism. I say that this is the nature of the problem that they and we are facing, to try and get this much assistance to so many people in such a short period of time. But it is testing the limits of our system of parliamentary democracy, which is supposed to be about scrutiny and carefully making sure every dollar is carefully spent. I think with the best will in the world, everyone who looks at this knows that massive amounts of this are going to be misspent, but there's just no alternative.
Althea?
Well, the alternative is for Canadians to not take advantage of some of the loopholes, because there are some and they are glaring. Yeah, so it's $95 billion so far. And the government is really clear that basically they're still adjusting and tweaking the programs and that more is going to be announced in the weeks and perhaps months to come. I think already the problem with some of the things that have been announced is that the gaps are already showing. And sometimes I think when you push out programs incredibly quickly, the communication around the programs has not been as smooth as perhaps it could have been. And so that is still an ongoing challenge for the government. It doesn't seem to be able to give clear answers to very simple questions. And I know, we in the media are flooded with emails and Twitter messages and phone calls from Canadians who are worried and want to know what they should apply for. And MPs' offices are the same.
The advice I'm giving is apply for anything and see what happens. Apply for all of it and hope for the best, because honestly, you're right. It's all changing so quickly and the details are changing quickly too. All right, another political dynamic at play in the midst of all this is the relationship between the provinces and Ottawa. There was a call, there have been many calls, in fact, between the Prime Minister and First Ministers. But here's some of what Justin Trudeau had to say about the call on Thursday, earlier today.
We're going to talk about how to continue working together to keep people safe and supported. Over the last few weeks, in the face of an unprecedented challenge, we've seen all levels of government cooperating on a response. And going forward, that collaboration will become even more important.
Okay, there are some extraordinary things happening on these conversations and in these press conferences. Doug Ford just saying really effusive, lovely things about the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. But there is massive coordination happening, whether it be around equipment or testing or all the things we've talked about, the data as well. How well do you think it's going, and how surprised are you by the way the relationships seem to be working, Chantal?
I'm not surprised, although if you look south, some surprise might be in order. But we have seen provinces and the federal government come together to face challenges and overcome differences over NAFTA, for instance, which was not as much of a crisis. I'm curious to see how that is going to evolve with diminishing supplies for medical emergencies and for dealing with this crisis, and the attempt to coordinate and send it where it's most needed, while other provinces might say, well, gee, we need them too. So I think there's some fairly heavy collaborative challenges coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, they did today talk about how, they did on Thursday talk about how if one province became, a real terrible space or went into a bad space with this, had a surge and other places of the country didn't, then provinces would be sort of expected to send things to that region, which sounds, sounds logical, Andrew. But when you're in the midst of something, sometimes those pressures on cooperation play out a little differently.
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing that south of the border, for example, where states are bidding against each other. it's going to be very hairy from everything we've heard in the next couple of weeks, that where the provinces are, or some of the provinces anyway, are going to run into particular supply constraints. And when I say supply constraints, I mean probably people dying as a result of that. That is going to make everything, put a lot of pressure on everybody here to try and move as fast as they can. And there's another challenge in the longer term, which is that this is going to destroy the finances of some of the provinces. We've already had this shocking news that Newfoundland, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago, was basically unable to find any buyers for its debt. The Bank of Canada has basically had to step in to buy its debt. And the longer this goes on, the more that some other provinces may be facing some similar difficulties. So that puts all the provinces in a position of having to rely on the federal government to assist them, whether it's on the federal treasury side or on the Bank of Canada side. And that will also mean either closer cooperation or more fighting, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it will change the dynamic for sure. That's a good point, Althea, because I do think there are other provinces moving in the direction that Newfoundland and Labrador was in.
Yes, I mean, and we know that, for example, in Alberta, what's happened to the oil sector has been just horrendous. To answer your first question about, could we have expected this? And, everybody's right to point to the United States and Donald Trump and the fight with the Democratic governors, for example. And I think that there may have been some concerns that, Jason Kenney, for example, who used the provincial election to campaign against Justin Trudeau, would take a more partisan tone towards the federal government. And we really have not seen that. In fact, we know the provinces don't always agree. I mean, we've seen that on the emergencies, the use of the Emergencies Act, for example. Some of the eastern provinces were in favor. Jason Kenney in Alberta was not. We know that some of the chief medical officers in the provinces don't necessarily agree with a chief medical officer federally. But when it comes to the public face of the crisis, the thing that I think has been very impressive, at least to me, I've felt kind of touched emotionally, is that an appropriate thing to say?
Reassured?
About how everybody has really kind of embraced a pan-Canadian and the federal government who's talking about Team Canada approach. And we have seen that. And we even have seen that federally across the aisle. It just on Thursday, when the finance minister was speaking to the finance committee, Pierre Poilievre, who's known as an attack dog, started off by acknowledging that the finance minister was working really hard, and these are impressive times when you have the NDP and the conservative members suggesting the same things should be done: a universal basic income, calling for this wage subsidy, getting the federal government to change course, and the Liberals to embrace an idea championed by the opposition. It's nice that in a time of crisis, we are not seeing those really stark partisan divides that we are seeing south of the border.
But surely that can't be enduring because I'm cynical.
It will not be.
No,
certainly not be.
But they
Chantal, yeah.
But
Chantal.
they're all in the same boat,
right?
And they all need each other. And when we see those projections, you're probably going to see differences in outlooks for some provinces versus others.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we are not coming out of this until every province has come out of it. And I think that's going to be important to remember in the weeks ahead.
Last word to you, Andrew.
Quite frankly, some of these premiers look quite frightened, and I don't blame them for 1 second. I think they know what's coming down the pike, and that induces a great deal of seriousness in a hurry.
Okay.
Yes.
Good to see you all. Appreciate you being here every week. Thank you very much. Stay healthy.